Welcome to the Functional Medicine Doc Talk podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kurt Woeller, talking with experts in functional and integrative health and medicine, discussing critical information for improving your health and wellness to help you live a long, full life. Let's get to it. Hi, this is Dr. Kurt Woeller, and in this episode, I have a conversation with Julie Matthews. Julie is a certified nutrition consultant. She's been involved in published research with regards to nutrition and dietary interventions specific for autism. She received her master's degree in medical nutrition from Arizona State University, and she's also authored a number of books. The latest, titled The Personalized Autism Nutrition Plan, is excellent. We're going to talk about that book. We're going to talk about specialized diets for autism and other important topics. So here is my interview with Julie Matthews. Julie, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So you and I have known each other a long time. We've been working together for a number of years, but before we get into the main topic of our conversation, just give an overview of your education, your training, and specifically how you got involved and interested in working with the autism community.
Yeah, so I went to school, started my schooling back in over 20 years ago. And when I was in school, for my first year, I did a paper on ADHD because I was on a run in a park and there was this kids fair that was being set up, and all the food at the kids fair was like donuts and pizza. And I just had this moment where I thought, this has to have something to do with all the ADHD that we have. And we feed the worst foods to kids with these brightly colored things. So that's what I decided to study for my first year paper. And then during that meeting, I met a man, Michael Lang, who was a dad who recovered his kids from autism. And he really just went over ADHD very quickly. And he wanted to talk the whole time about autism. So this 1 hour meeting turned into 3 hours, and he told me, he could about the underlying biochemistry and how these kids, many of them are very sick. We're not just talking about some neurodiversity. We're talking about kids that might have chronic diarrhea and be in pain and all these kinds of things. And he said, and there's so much we can do and there's so much science, but not many people are doing it. And we need people to do it. So that was it for me. The second year, I spent all my time focused on autism, and I was just committed after that because I found it so fascinating. And so that's kind of how I got involved in it. And I've just found it to be so rewarding because it's so helpful and the science is so fascinating to me that kind of between those two things, I was really just very focused ever since.
So what he was getting at was, I guess what's being termed now is profound autism. So with regards to his own sons, right? I mean, they obviously
he had a son and a daughter. Yes. Okay.
2 kids. So, and diet played a major role in their recovery?
Yes. So that, and then also, of course, after that, just seeing people and seeing, there's such a range. I guess that is why it's called autism spectrum disorder. There's such a spectrum of it, as you know. And sometimes there are, I don't know. You hear a lot of the naysayers out there, but my experience has been can be incredibly beneficial to do diet and nutrition.
I had a doctor tell me once that diet and nutrition had nothing to do with health. So that was unbelievable. But I've seen a number of deniers, particularly in the autism world too, with regards to the biomedical interventions that we do. So at its core, why is healthy eating and specific dietary intervention so important in autism from your experience?
Well, as you said, just starting at that health perspective, I mean, children, most people get diagnosed when they're children. And so that's usually when people are looking for solutions. So if we assume that we're talking of course, we can help adults as well. But if we say, nutrition is important for health at any age, but also particularly important for children. So just from that perspective alone, we need good nutrition, good healthy fats, good protein, for all the building blocks of our muscles and brain and everything that we need, all growth and repair needs this. So just from a really super basic level, eating healthy and then determining what dietary intervention is best is really important. And then if we take it the step further and we say, okay, well, how do we apply this to autism? Well, there are many underlying factors that maybe we'll get into a little bit later, but there are all of these underlying factors that can contribute to how the brain is functioning. And we can apply certain dietary and nutrition principles specifically to help relieve the burden on those systems or to help empower and support those systems. So that's a little bit kind of on the overview level of why good diet and nutrition is so important.
So my first autism biomedical conference was in 1998. It was in San Diego. It was the first Defeat Autism Now conference that I had gone to. And at that time, it was actually sponsored by the Autism Research Institute in San Diego. Bernard Rimland started that organization. And even in that time, I remember them talking a lot about the gluten casein-free diet. And that's the first time I'd actually heard of that diet. And it was one, and it actually still is, when you go back and look at the information from the Autism Research Institute and the early work that Dr. Rimland had done, was one of those interventions that ranked very high amongst parents, really across the United States and around the world, as having a positive influence on their children, particularly with regards to eye contact, and awareness, sometimes sleep, sometimes behavior. So very, very important. And I know you obviously know a lot about it and have recommended, removing those foods from individuals' diets. Can you discuss a little bit about your maybe introduction, obviously from that one father you had that, but the brief history of dietary intervention in autism, maybe tying in the gluten casein component, what's happening with gluten casein in many of these kids, and why removing it seems to really help.
Yes. So you're right. It is probably the most commonly used of the therapeutic diets in autism. And it is one of the two most heavily studied diets in autism. And I think there's a number of reasons why so many people find it so beneficial. There are so many different mechanisms by which the diet can address various underlying factors that might be going on for any one person. So one is gut inflammation. So both of these proteins, gluten, which is the protein in grains like wheat and rye, barley, and others, and casein, one of the proteins in dairy, they are very inflammatory, and they can really add to any inflammation that might be going on in the gut and contribute to any leaky gut. Also, if we then have, let's say, we have maybe leaky gut, we've got some inflammation, we're not able to break down our foods. We're supposed to be able to break down our proteins into all the individual amino acids. So if we can't do that, what these two proteins have in common is they have this kind of weak bond at one of the positions, and it allows the protein to get slightly broken down, but not all the way broken down. It's broken down into these peptide chains that fit in the opiate receptor. So they're opiate-like compounds that get created and literally fit in the same receptor that morphine and heroin do. And so if you imagine that, then it can have very significant effects on addictions to those foods, effects on pain level, cognitive function, all sorts of different things. And so that's the second one. They're more common to be food sensitivities, things like that in our current environment. So those are just a couple of the ways. So if you imagine that it can contribute to challenges with the gut, then we might not be able to absorb our nutrients. And then we can't get those nutrients we need to everywhere, including the brain. If we have opiates that get created, then that's going to, I think people can see that that's going to have a very direct effect on the brain. So those are just a couple of the ways. And I think those are a few of the reasons why I think the diet is so beneficial for so many people, because there are so many different ways that these foods might be a problem. And so it's likely that many kids, if I would maybe say even most, do better with this diet.
So one of the things when you mentioned about leaky gut, it's important for people to understand that when you look at the architecture of the lining of the digestive system, the components that make up the cellular structure, it's very similar to the blood-brain barrier. So when you get a leaky gut, you can actually have a leaky blood-brain barrier as well. One of the other things with regards that I've seen too, Julie, with the gluten casein component, you mentioned binding to the opiate receptors, and you mentioned the pain response. So I've actually had kids where they started to respond to what would normally be a painful stimuli more appropriately when they go off of those foods. So whether that's touching something hot, might be a hot pan, or running into something, or hurting their knee, or hitting their head, where a neurotypical child might respond, whereas many of the autistic kids sometimes don't, or not to the degree that you would think. The other thing too is constipation. So one of the side effects of many of the opiate medications is constipation. And so it can just sort of blunt that sensory response. So interesting with regards to some of those mechanisms. And the inflammatory aspect is really important as well, because we know that gut inflammation, systemic inflammation, and neurological inflammation is a huge part of this population.
Absolutely. And it really, all chronic disease has a component of inflammation, and it's no different in autism. And then if you have inflammation, like you said, in the gut, you very often can get systemic inflammation. Now you can have inflammation in all different parts. And one of the aspects of autism is this aspect of brain inflammation that we see. So those are definitely factors. And then if you have inflammation in the brain, how does it affect your ability to function? Well, you can imagine, like, if I have a headache, just a simple thing, it's going to be hard for me to focus, pay attention, think clearly, do my job well, So imagine that somebody is having some sort of inflammation on a daily basis. It's going to likely have some effects. And actually, in the paper that Dr. Adams and I published back in 2023 on 13 different therapeutic diets, the gluten-free, casein-free diet, about 31% of kids who were on that diet had improvements in attention, and 29% in cognition, and 25% in language. And I don't know if you see this, but I'm sure you probably do, because I see all the time when people change to a gluten and casein-free diet, those kids with autism start having more language.
Oh, 100%. I mean, it's absolutely something that I've seen. And again, better eye contact, being more aware, but most definitely an improvement in language. It doesn't happen in every child. There's no magic bullet for these different types of problems, but I look at the gluten casein-free diet as a foundational diet, something to remove. It is a major puzzle piece of the autism puzzle for many kids. So it's very important. So the big question is it enough? So in your opinion, your experience, is the gluten casein-free diet enough for most individuals with autism?
That's a great question. I don't think anyone's ever asked me that. I think it does depend on the individual, and I'm going to give a better answer than that, because that's just not a very fun answer. I think it can be enough for some people. I think if the diet is healthy, gluten and casein-free diet, I think that can be enough for a lot of people. I think the big challenge there is that the gluten and casein-free diet is not inherently a healthy diet. It can be, but many of the, artificially colored candies are also gluten casein free, and that would not be, that definitely would not be enough in my experience to improve symptoms if there are things like that. So I think if it were free of artificial additives and sugar and things like that, I think for a lot of kids, if that gluten-free and casein-free diet was healthy, I think that would go a long way for lots of kids. With that said, I'd say about 70% or so of kids in my kind of experience and research have problems with sulfation. And that might indicate, and also a vast majority have microbiome issues. And between those two things, I do think we often might need to bring in other dietary principles for lots of kids to address some of that.
So it's interesting you bring up making sure that it's a healthy diet. When I first started lecturing in San Diego after that DAN conference that I went to in the late 90s, so I forget the timing of things, but probably within that year or two, I started going to support groups around San Diego and talking about biomedical intervention and testing and a little bit of what I knew at that time. And of course, the gluten casein-free diet was well promoted, but when I would go to many of these support groups, it was all about the gluten casein-free treats, cookies, cakes, muffins, so I'm like, something's missing here, because you can eat a kind of a lousy gluten casein-free diet. So what you're getting at is critically important. As long as it's healthy, it's incorporating other real foods, not that you're just using a gluten-free cookie as opposed to a regular cookie.
Yes, exactly.
So one of the other things that came up many years ago, so in the transition of the discussion of diets for autism, was this mention of the specific carbohydrate diet. Now, I had first heard of the specific carbohydrate diet from a book called Breaking the Vicious Cycle, which was from Elaine Gottschall. And she actually wrote that specifically, if I remember correctly, for kids with inflammatory bowel disease.
Yes.
And so we use that diet quite a bit for adults with inflammatory bowel disease, both Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. And so this became a very popular diet, still is, within the autism community. And I often saw it or see it as a transition from the gluten casein-free diet. So I want to ask you your opinion, your experience of the specific carbohydrate diet. What is it, if somebody's not heard of it before? And then we can expand it from there. So what has been your experience with a specific carbohydrate diet?
Well, it's an interesting question, because I first found out about this diet. Actually, I was working at Whole Foods, and I was talking to a customer, and I told her that my specialty was autism, and she said, "Oh, do you know the book Breaking the Vicious Cycle?" And I said, "No, I don't know." And this was actually before it was even talked about in autism. At least at autism conferences, it hadn't been talked about. There obviously some parents knew about it. So I said, no. So she went over to our bookshelf and it was there on the shelf. And so I bought it that day, and then I read it. And then I don't know how many months or whatever later, it became, I think within a year, it had been started to be talked about at the conferences. So I feel, first I just thought that was, a lot of times I find out so many amazing things from the parents. So just first of all, give credit where it's due. And then I started working with the diet, and I've worked a lot with the diet. And Jill,
if I can real quickly, what is the diet? Can you describe what the specific carbohydrate diet is and what it's used for specifically?
Yes, it is a diet that's grain-free and basically starch-free, although the rules are a little bit unique. So there's no grains, no potatoes, no corn. They do allow a few legumes, but only certain ones. There's no sugars outside of monosaccharides. So you could do fruit, for example, but not, let's say, table sugar or maple syrup or something like that. So you can do honey and fruit and some sugars like that. No lactose. So no, I was going to say no dairy. I make the diet pretty much dairy-free for all of my clients because of the first casein issue. But theoretically, the diet in its original form was just removing lactose. So they would do, 24-hour fermented yogurt and things like that where the lactose was fermented out. Let's see. So that's the gist of the diet. So it's lots of non-starchy vegetables and protein, meat, and poultry, and it can include nuts and things like that, although, depending, sometimes people do stages to get there. But if we just talk about the full diet itself, just to give people a picture of what the diet looks like, it's lots of whole foods, and it just avoids all rice and grains and potatoes and things like that.
Now, my first introduction to it was with individuals with inflammatory bowel disease. And we know that a subset of the autistic individuals have inflammatory bowel disease.
Yes.
It may not necessarily be fully recognized because they're not all getting scopes, for example, but autistic enterocolitis is a well-documented condition. And so it would fall in that spectrum, if you will, of an inflammatory bowel condition. And so this was, at least my early understanding of the specific carbohydrate diet, was to help individuals with inflammatory bowel disease.
Absolutely.
Can you describe a little bit, at least your understanding of why somebody with an inflammatory bowel disease condition get benefit from a specific carbohydrate diet?
Yes, I think part of it has to do with the microbiome, which we are learning day by day is more and more important than, I think it's one of the key things personally. And so actually one of the ways that this specific carbohydrate diet works or was originally understood to address is the microbiome. And when we aren't able to break down these carbohydrates, when we don't have the enzymes and things we need to break them down, or when we have maybe some dysbiosis in our microbiome, then our bacteria breaks it down, and that can create a lot of inflammation and gas and things, depending on if we're feeding the wrong bacteria in the wrong place or whatever else it might be. And so then when it starts to become this fuel, then we can get more damage to the gut, and then the gut releases more mucus and things to try to protect itself. That makes it more difficult for our own digestive enzymes and things to do their work. And more inflammation, of course, adds to all of this. And so it becomes, as Elaine Gottschall said, a vicious cycle of inflammation and inability to break down these carbohydrates and absorb these carbohydrates, and then fueling more of these bacteria that overgrow and all of this. And so I think that the way the diet helps inflammatory bowel conditions is, one, by removing the grains that and the things that can often add to the inflammation. But I think at the core of that, even deeper, is the way that it influences the microbiome.
Which is, I think, also why, particularly with regards to the microbiome, and you're mentioning about decreasing sort of the substrate that's left over for these bacteria to use to ferment, to kind of fuel their own survival, of why it's now become a popular diet actually in the world of SIBO, so small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, which people with inflammatory bowel, Crohn's, and many of the autistic individuals have. They have a SIBO type of condition. So from that, my understanding, at least from what I remember in the experience of the evolution of autism diets, for example, came the GAPS diet. And that became quite popular, still is very popular. I know there's many nutritionists who get certified as a GAPS practitioner. Can you describe a little bit about what the GAPS diet is, perhaps how it's similar and maybe differs from the specific carbohydrate diet, because they somewhat come from the same roots? Go ahead.
So the GAPS diet is the gut and psychology syndrome diet. That's what GAPS stands for. And it was created by Dr. Natasha Campbell McBride, who used the diet to help her son with autism, and created her own diet from the kind of the underpinnings of the specific carbohydrate diet. So the GAPS diet has very, very similar, almost identical food list to the specific carbohydrate diet. There are a few exceptions in there, but for the most part, I'd say 95% of the foods themselves are the same. The approach is a bit different. So the approach is, what I talk about in my book, I think it's a little bit based on your personality. Like the GAPS diet is it lays everything out very methodically. You start with this in this stage, and you do these foods these many times a day, and then you add these things. So the foods are similar, but the way they're introduced is a little different. Also, she puts more emphasis on broths, like bone broths and fermented foods, which generally I think are very good foods. And then also it includes other aspects. So it's a little bit different in the realm of the supplementation. So specific carbohydrate diet is a little bit more restrictive and strict in the supplements it will allow. For example, probiotics is one of them. So you can only do, a small amount of certain strains of lactobacillus with SCD, but with GAPS, they do different. They do more probiotics. They do different things there. And they have a little bit more of a kind of a detox component. So I'd say theirs is a little bit more of a protocol, if you will, that includes some additional principles.
Right. I've always kind of viewed it as more of like a program. And the specific carbohydrate diet is very rigid in just the dietary aspect, whereas the GAPS tends to incorporate other strategies. Yes. And I know that there are some intrinsic challenges with the GAPS diet. So one of those being the potential for high oxalate. And can you explain why that might occur with the GAPS diet and why some parents recognize that? Yes.
So way back when, and this is not only unique to the GAPS diet, it's also involved with the specific carbohydrate diet. So what people would do is instead of doing grain flours like wheat-based muffins or let's say a gluten-free rice flour muffin, they couldn't do the grain, so they started doing almond flour and pecan flour and these types of nut flours. And these are incredibly high in oxalate. So, a quarter cup of almond flour has about 10 times the daily amount of oxalate. For somebody that needs a low oxalate diet, it might have, but it still has several times more, even for the average person, of what we would normally consume in a day. And that's from a quarter cup. And I've had clients that, were doing a half a dozen or more, let's say muffins or, other types of baked good products that were of these, nut flours and things. And so that is, I think, part of the challenge. Again, you can always make a diet, GAPS diet or specific carbohydrate diet. You can make it low oxalate, but you'd have to really put a concerted effort and you'd have to understand the principle of oxalate before you'd, realize to do that. And so that's one thing. And there was just some interesting things when I first started going to the Autism One conference, maybe it was back in like 2004, and people were talking about this diet, but they were saying that there were these plateaus or these like negative periods that people were getting, and they were kind of like clockwork. And some of us always wondered, could that have been that there was so much oxalate? Those were oxalate dumps. And I don't know that per se, but I do think that it's good to understand some of these broader principles when you're about to implement a diet. And I know that can sometimes make it, a bit, I don't want to say maybe overwhelming or a bit of a learning curve. Let me put it that way, a learning curve. And that's why, in my book, the second half is not like, we can talk about it, but the first half is a little bit more like kind of general, essential kind of healthy principles for most people, whereas the second half is all about the different therapeutic diets. And I really stress in the book, it's better if you read the whole second half before you implement anything, because there are some of these components, like I talk about the specific carbohydrate diet before I talk about oxalates, but in that section on the specific carbohydrate diet, I say, please read the low oxalate diet section before you implement, So it is a little bit of a learning curve on some of these diets, just to kind of, figure out what might be the best way to implement one, or maybe if you want to combine some of the principles from multiple diets together.
Well, this is all a learning process. It's all a journey. And your book, the new book, the Personalized Autism Nutrition Plan, we're absolutely going to talk about, because that's become a very important part of my practice, is that book is recommended to pretty much everybody, unless the parent has, very skilled themselves already in dietary intervention. You. So I'm going to put you on the spot. Okay? I'm going to ask you the one question that I often get asked.
Okay.
What is the best autism diet?
That's funny. I worked with a guy that was like, this is totally a little tangent, but he was like a plastics expert, and he was like, okay, you don't want to do, the plastic lids on your cups, and you don't want to do this. And I had asked like, well, what's the best plastic, and he laughed. He's like, there is no best plastic. So I kind of feel like there is no best diet. Although this is a little different because that was talking about toxins and this is talking about healthy things. So my analogy is a little bit off there, but okay, what's the best diet? I would say the diet that addresses the underlying factors for that individual. And I know that is not an answer, but it is in that's actually how I pick the best diet for any one of my clients, is that I look for what symptoms do they have? What foods do they eat a lot of? What reactions do they get from those foods? What are the most common symptoms associated with those foods? What do their labs look like? Do they have some of the underlying factors in those labs that might lead me to one thing or another? Are they having carbohydrate digestion challenges? And that might lead us more to that specific carbohydrate direction. Do they have food sensitivities that are showing sensitivities to dairy or opioid compounds in their urine to gluten, or, these kinds of things? So do they have oxalate levels that show up high on their oxalate test? So I look at a combination of symptoms, their diet, their known reactions, their functional lab tests, their genetics, and to try to figure out the best diet for that person.
So Julie, that was a perfect response. And in fact, that was a brilliant answer, because the reality is it comes down to bio-individual nutrition, which I believe is a term you coined, but perhaps not. At least I'm going to give you credit for it. So,
yes. Go ahead.
This happens all the time. This is the same thing happening now with the whole discussion of leucovorin, which is a high dose folinic acid, because there's a study that comes out. They're trying to get approval for it in autism, and so, and I'm not blaming anybody, but the reality is people go, oh, leucovorin, that must be good, so I want to try that. And what you realize is that bio-individual nutrition really can have expanded in this world of biomedical intervention, is that there is no one thing that is 100% effective for everybody to the same degree. Basic, obviously you need to breathe air and drink, water, and those are fundamental aspects of our body, but there's no one supplement that's going to work 100% the same way. I get asked all the time, what's the best supplement for Candida? What's the best probiotic for Clostridia? What is the best this or that? And it comes down to, there are percentages, right? I often work off the 80-20 rule, and that most of the things that we do from a biomedical, functional, integrative medicine standpoint tend to work very well for about 80% of the kids. And then there's about 20% you may not see a change. And the same thing to me would come in the realm of diet. So I love that description, because it really truly is, and what you described is a bio-individual approach.
Yes, absolutely. And that's why I think sometimes even when we look at the studies, we don't see, 100% or, sometimes there's some, uncertainty of like, well, who is this for? My thoughts there is that, you take a whole autism population, the general autism population, no one thing is going to work for everybody, but those that it works for, it works incredibly well. So I think the research on the GFCF diet that, let's say, shows that it does well, I actually think it does even better than that, because for those that it does work for, it works incredibly well for. And so, yes, I agree with what you're saying there. I think it's very bio-individual, and, that's why I think it's great for parents to, sometimes you feel like you have to be an expert in everything, but you do know your child better than everybody else, and you do see them and you feed them every meal of every day. So you have a lot of information, and you can really in some ways be the best detective. Now, it's always great to seek out support from other professionals if you can't or, don't want to do it all on your own, but you have so many clues that you can at least pass on to somebody else to help figure out that bio-individual component to help create that best approach for that person.
So you mentioned about specific things regarding certain diets, sulfur sensitivity, sulfur chemistry issues, oxalate. We talked about something that you didn't mention. Maybe you did. I missed it. Was phenol sensitivity. So, we could have an entire discussion about any one of these things, oxalate, phenol, sulfur problems, for example. But those things tend to have unique characteristics. So they're clues, as you being a nutritionist detective, trying to determine what diet or component of a diet might work the best. Can you give maybe just a brief overview of what makes you think a child might have an oxalate issue as opposed to maybe a sulfur or phenol sensitivity issue? Are there specific symptoms and characteristics that they would present that a parent would say, I think this is what's happening?
Yes, there are. And actually, that's one of the ways I like to, as I mentioned earlier, kind of figure out what I think might be the best diet is what symptoms do they have. And for a couple of reasons. One is because over the years, people will come to me and someone will say, this X diet worked amazing on my child, and the same diet worked terrible on another person. And so I started to look at, okay, well, what are the symptoms that they had? What are the symptoms it helped with? What is the underlying biochemistry that affected them? What was going on with their gut? What were those things? And then also looking at what I would call symptom clusters. So, if somebody came to you as a doctor and they said, I have fatigue, it could be one of 500 different things, right?
Right.
But if they told you, well, I have fatigue and I, have a diet that doesn't have any red meat in it and I've had very heavy periods, it might lead you to think one thing over another thing. Now, if someone came to you and said, well, I have a lot of fatigue and I eat a lot of almond flour and I also have a lot of pain, that might lead me to think something different. So the cluster of symptoms I feel is more helpful than any one individual symptom. Now, sometimes that one symptom might be so clear that it might be kind of I'm coining this in this very moment, but like a keystone symptom, it might be one of the more common, bigger symptoms. But for the most part, I'm always looking for these groupings of symptoms, which is why, in my book, I put together common symptoms associated with each of the food compounds that you're removing in each of the diets, because those are the things. Two things. I created that list from two things. One was all of this experience I've had over the years, but also the second thing I was going to say is that study that Dr. Adams and I did on the 13 diets. Not only did we look at which diets did well, but we looked at which symptoms improved with which diets. And we determined that certain diets helped improve certain symptoms more than other diets. And so that we could start to use those as a way to pinpoint and personalize a dietary approach. And so I used a combination of the research we did there, the rest of the research that's out there, the experience with my clients to create these symptom checklists.
So let's talk about that research. And if you can you pull out maybe some examples of, let's say, sulfur chemistry imbalance and phenol sensitivity? Explain what that is, for example, and where that fell in your research. So first off, explain that paper, because that came out recently. This was something within the past couple of years. And really important from really important from just a dietary standpoint to be able to help somebody visualize and maybe the better way of describing it is categorize what diet or components of a diet could be useful for select kids based on their symptoms. So go ahead.
So the paper was called Ratings of the Effectiveness of 13 Therapeutic Diets for Autism Spectrum Disorder. And there was a survey of, in this case, the diet portion, a little over 800 families filled out this portion. But what was also cool about the survey is that it also looked at nutraceuticals, so nutritional supplements, and psychiatric and seizure medications. So not only did the paper specifically talk about the diet results, but we were able to compare it to those other things. And interestingly, the overall benefit of all of the diets put together was significantly higher than both nutraceuticals and psychiatric and seizure medications, which I didn't necessarily expect the nutraceutical portion, but and then also was significantly less likely than psychiatric and seizure medications to have adverse effects. So firstly, just from diets in general, all the diets did well, and diets in general compared to other things did very well. Then we looked at various different diets. And so we looked at, a gluten-free, casein-free diet together. We looked at a gluten-free alone, a casein-free alone, a variety of different food allergen and food intolerance type diets. We looked at the specific carbohydrate diet, a Feingold diet, which, if we refer back to the rest of your question, which is a low phenol diet. It's going to be a diet that's low in artificial food additives and a compound called salicylates. And so we looked at a variety of different diets and then looked at which symptoms improved with which diets. So to add to that, your question was, well, let's apply this to sulfur chemistry and some of those diets. So if we take a step back, there was another study that Dr. Adams and I did on a comprehensive diet and nutrition approach for autism. And it looked at 6 interventions, including a healthy, gluten-free, casein-free, and soy-free diet. And one of the interventions was Epsom salt baths, which is supplying sulfate to help with that sulfur chemistry. And that was actually a very beneficial part of the study that lots of parents said they wanted to continue. And part of the reason that was added to the design of that study was because even earlier research of Dr. Adams found that kids with autism tend to be low in sulfur and tend to, from even further research by other people, have poor sulfation or sulfur chemistry. So that leads us to this diet, this Feingold diet. It works in part because these phenol compounds, both artificial and natural compounds, are broken down by this sulfur chemistry, basically. So if we don't have enough sulfate and sulfur, we don't have enough of these enzymes in the sulfur chemistry, then these things that in some cases are even healthy foods like berries and cinnamon and grapes and things like that can have negative symptoms for some people. And it was one of the highest performing diets. It was the Feingold diet had one of the highest benefits and no reported adverse effects, and was really wonderful for improving things like hyperactivity. So it was the number one diet for hyperactivity, where 45% of the individuals that did this diet, if they had hyperactivity, their hyperactivity improved. And if you've ever looked at a scientific study before, I think you'd be hard pressed to find any intervention that helps almost half of the people. I mean, it's an incredible number of
it's pretty impressive.
People. Yeah.
So you're talking about the phenol sulfur transferase.
Yes.
Enzyme reactions in the liver.
Yes.
Do you think that has to do with perhaps other environmental compounds that might be occupying that pathway?
Yes.
So there's some interference?
Absolutely. So pathogenic bacteria and others give off phenolic compounds or compounds that require sulfate to remove them. So, for example, in fact, the paper just came out, I think it was this year, another paper by Dr. Adams. For people, James Adams has done dozens, if not hundreds of studies on autism. And the most recent paper
by the way, I interviewed him last year. So people want to go back. Yeah, he was one of the, I forget what episode it was, but it was a very interesting conversation.
Yes, people should definitely check that out. So the most recent one looked at p-cresol and how p-cresol is higher in kids with autism and how p-cresol can affect the brain. And so this phenolic compound, this p-cresol, needs our good sulfate to basically detoxify this toxin that the pathogens use to kind of get a foothold and thrive in the gut and kind of take over the microbiome. So we have to use our good sulfate to try to detoxify this substance that they're continuously creating. So that's one way that our bodies are depleting itself of sulfur. And one of the reasons I believe that this diet and these types of diets can be so helpful.
So it goes back to the microbiome. So that 4-cresol or what's called p-cresol is also called 4-cresol. And that gets produced by certain Clostridia bacteria. In fact, one of the bacteria that produces it is certain strains of Clostridium difficile. And that plays a number of other negative roles in the brain and nervous system. It interferes with dopamine metabolism, for example. But they've actually also looked at it as a specific toxin in neurons, particularly with regards to, I can't remember if it's the synapse communication between nerve cells or if it just somehow disrupts the release of certain neurotransmitters. I have to go back and look at that. But it's definitely a synaptic toxin, a nervous system toxin. And then, to add to this, Julie, because what you're getting at, we talk about diet, we talk about microbiome, and we talk about foods, and all of these things can lead to balances or imbalances. But much of it comes back to the microbiome, which we know is often greatly impaired and imbalanced in this community of people.
Yes.
The other thing I wanted to ask you about was many years ago, and I don't hear much talked about it now, but it was talked about many years ago that many autistic individuals were what they call sulfur wasters. They're basically wasting sulfate out of the body. So do you remember that discussion?
Yes.
And the question I've often asked was why? Why is that happening? Is there something in the kidneys, for example, that isn't reabsorbing it? And I have my suspicions, and I wanted to maybe get your take, but my suspicion, at least in part, is that it's an oxalate interference problem.
Interesting. Yeah, my understanding, I would agree with that because some of the research I did on that sulfate wasting has to do with ATP in the kidneys. And if they don't have good mitochondrial function in the kidneys, that the kidneys waste sulfate. And so if one of the disruptors of the mitochondria is oxalate. So I think that you could be onto something there.
And I believe it has to do too with the receptor transporters that are bringing sulfate back into the body, essentially, basically for redistribution, and then the excretion of oxalate. But when you have a lot of oxalate around, it's occupying those receptors or those transporters, and that's what's causing partly. It may also be a mitochondrial problem too. And we know that these kids are often poor detoxifiers, so they come in contact with a number of different toxins. It could be metals. It could be a number of other compounds that are maybe interfering with kidney mitochondrial function. I never thought of it, the mitochondrial aspect in the kidney, but that's very, very interesting. So really great discussion. And so really, I think it's really important for people to understand that it sounds like one of the highest rated diets within your study was that whole phenol sulfur chemistry, component.
Yes.
Which when you dig deeper and understand some of the underlying biological complexities in autism, that pattern definitely fits.
Yes, exactly. It does. And I have found that this is one of the diets I use a lot. Now, I don't only use the quote Feingold diet. I use a variety of different low salicylate diet approaches. And they are one of the diet approaches I find to be very beneficial. And so it was actually good to also see that a lot of the symptoms that Dr. Feingold was using the diet to address and that I've also seen in practice were the things that came up that parents reported. So it's nice when all of the experience and research kind of comes together with a consistent, narrative there.
Right. Okay. My next put you on the spot question.
Okay.
How long should kids follow a specific diet? What are some dietary rules?
Oh, okay. Every single chapter has a section that literally says, how long should I stay on this step? Because it does depend, right? But we'll generalize it. We'll generalize it for people. I would say usually, giving a diet, say 6 weeks, is usually a pretty good amount of time to get a sense. Now, there are exceptions. I don't necessarily feel that way about the low oxalate diet, because that one needs to go much more slowly. It could take weeks, if not months, just to get to low oxalate. So again, there's always exceptions to this, but let's say like a gluten-free diet or a low salicylate diet or, a low histamine diet, usually in several weeks, 3 to 6 weeks, you have a pretty good idea of if you're seeing anything or not. And then if you're not seeing anything, then I would not say abandon diet. So that is kind of the wrong conclusion, I think, that sometimes people make. Sometimes it's add another diet principle. So Dr. Sidney Baker has a great, TAC theory. Is you're sitting on 2 tacks and you remove 1 tack, you're not going to get 50% reduction in your symptoms. That's the first half.
Right.
And then no amount of aspirin is going to, help. So the first part of that, if you have 2 dietary principles or 2 food compounds you are reacting to, if you remove one, you may not see a 50% reduction. You may not see any change in symptoms till you remove both of them. And so I do see this challenge a lot. Probably the most common one is people that do a gluten-free, casein-free diet. They don't see any benefit, but then they add a low oxalate diet, a low salicylate diet on top of it. And boom, all of a sudden, so many symptoms are improving. And that's because I find that a lot of people have a challenge with both of these. And if they give up after they do the GFCF diet, then I think that they're really missing an opportunity to see if there might be something else going on.
I think what a lot of these things is they have a synergistic effect.
Yes.
So that they sort of build on each other. And
yes.
I think where the whole aspects of just diet is the whole question of how long does my child have to be on this diet? Again, that goes back to the bio-individual approach. How long does my child have to be on the supplement? How long does my child have to be on B12 shots, for example? There's maybe, laws of averages that we can kind of work with, but some of it comes down to the individual. How are they responding? Are they continuing to get benefit long term? Sometimes the only way to know whether there is ongoing benefit is to maybe stop the therapy. But what can't be compromised, Julie, and I know you're going to agree, is a healthy, whole food, real food diet. That to me is forever.
Yes.
Whether somebody absolutely has to be on a casein-free diet the rest of their life, we don't know. Okay, some may, some may not. Same thing with, sulfur sensitivity, etc. So the whole point is to become self-educated in this, empower yourself through education like your book, and just keep building your knowledge base and trying new things. So here's another question.
Yeah.
Should the whole family make dietary changes or just the child with autism? What's been your experience with that type of scenario?
Absolutely. I think the whole family. And that's for a couple reasons. One is because, most of us have similar genetic components to our relatives. And so what helps the child often will create improvements in other family members. So I have one family that did my program, and the child had improvement, and this is one of a number of stories, so I might be, putting a couple stories together, but the gist of this experience I see frequently is the child with autism improves in their autism symptom, and then the sibling might have, let's say, anxiety, and their anxiety improves, and mom and dad might have an autoimmune condition, maybe a digestive disorder, and their symptoms improve. I've had more than one client where the moms have lost, over 50 pounds, because for them, those gluten and dairy components were really causing, weight gain for them. So, absolutely. So from just a perspective of health of the whole family, what is often good for one is often good for others. Now, again, everyone's bio-individual. Some might have other allergies or different things, and they might need something different. But generally speaking, if it helps one, there's a decent chance it might help others. The other component of it, though, is that if we single out that child and we're sitting and we're eating pizza in front of them and they're eating broccoli and brown rice, then that poor child is going to feel really unhappy about their diet choice. And it's just, I don't think, very fair to them. So I feel like if we're going to ask them to do it, we should do it. And, I recently did this for, my daughter. She needed a special diet, and it was a pretty strict one. And I thought, well, number one, I want to try the diet too, so I know what she's going through. And two, maybe it'll help me. And wouldn't you know, all of those things were the case. So I think that for a number of reasons, and even if it's just, okay, we're all going to do the healthy components of it. So, maybe there are some people, like someone in the family can't do this thing, or maybe the child needs a little more, sensory friendly versions, or, maybe there are some differences, and that's fine. But generally speaking, we don't eat wheat brownies in front of them. We all eat the broccoli on the table. Those kinds of things, I think, are really valuable.
I would 100% agree. The other thing is what I've seen over the years too, is as these kids start to feel better, as they become more aware, as they start to maybe express themselves more in their desires, they are, first off, they're incredibly intelligent. They're much more aware than people give them credit for.
Yes.
They just oftentimes can't express it. And what you had mentioned was, well, why am I eating this and you're eating that? It creates definite conflict. And the problem is in that child who doesn't have language.
Yes.
If they can't express themselves, it usually comes out in other ways: anxiety, behaviors, aggression. And in severe cases, we know that self-injurious behavior can be a problem too. So I completely agree. Let's talk about your new book. So, brilliant book. I am so happy you wrote this book.
Thank you.
I know it was a lot of time and energy. So the Personalized Autism Nutrition Plan. Discuss the book and why you feel it's so important for parents to read.
Well, I've been working on this. The program that's in the book is something that I've been using with parents for years now. And so you'll see in the book stories of children and families who got benefit from various different approaches. So it's based on real life experience. The program itself is based on years of work before that, working with families and research as well. So it's all based on clinical experience and research, and a program, a 12-step program that has been in use for years already. And so that's, I think, the first part of it. And while, I went back and forth with my publisher at the beginning of, do we call it an autism plan, or do we call it, other things? And we really, since, there aren't that many resources for families with autism. We really wanted to hone in and make it particularly beneficial for those families. So we did that. But, the subtitle is Nourishing Hope for Kids with ASD, ADHD, Anxiety, and Neurodevelopmental Delays. And you'll see in the book, I talk about sections on hyperactivity and ADHD in general. And there's a great story about a boy that doesn't have autism, but he has Tourette syndrome. And he's 16 years old, and he took his first cross-country flight as a pilot. So, and it got amazing results with his tics using the principles in the book. So it's not only for families and children with autism, but a variety of different neurological and neurodevelopmental conditions.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because it is, again, this is a book that I recommend to other parents who don't have, a child with autism, but they may have anxiety. They may have ADD, ADHD. 1 in 6 kids in the U.S. has some type of neurodevelopmental disorder. Mm-hmm. We're now looking at the recording of this podcast, 1 in 31 kids now are being diagnosed autistic. So it's important for people to understand that the diagnostic criteria may be different between autism, ADD, ADHD, and some neurodevelopmental problem, but many times the underlying biochemical imbalances are the same or similar. So there's a lot of overlap that's happening sort of internally from a biochemical, biological standpoint. So
exactly.
The information in this book is absolutely critical. Okay, so strategies. You've got a new parent who's just getting started. They're confused. Where do I go? What do I start with? What are some basic fundamental aspects that you would counsel a new parent on? Mm-hmm. Of course, your book, right? That's a given.
Yeah.
But can you think about some strategies for that new parent who's feeling overwhelmed? Like, where do I start with this whole process?
Yes. Step 1, get out the junk. So get out the artificial colors, flavors, preservatives, MSG, all of the just additives. And this is so timely because we just had Health and Human Services and the FDA, along with RFK Jr.'s leadership, ban 8 food dyes out of our food supply by the end of next year. So we have known for a long time these artificial dyes, these artificial additives add to negative behaviors in children and health challenges in children. So I think that's a great first step for parents, because if you're a little overwhelmed, and let's just say your child does, maybe eat lots of, maybe cookies or candy, or, maybe just more like kids' foods and things like that. Just simply changing those products from ones with artificial additives to one with natural colorings, natural flavorings, without the MSG and those derivatives, without the preservatives and things like that. That is I think a great way to start, because we have seen research for a long time on how beneficial that can be. And it doesn't require the child to make radical changes in their diet. So it's a great way for parents to, kind of get started, and see some potentially great improvements without a lot of disruption to what the child's familiar with.
And by the way, those things could be applied to a child who doesn't have autism. So that it's not like those rules are just for the autistic child, and then a different set of rules of getting out the junk for other groups of kids. So that's huge. And then your book lays out good strategies, right? On sort of the beginning aspects of where to start.
Absolutely. So, that is the first step in the book, and also goes through lists of these additives to avoid, ways to get healthier food options in. Step number 2 is a healthy diet. What does a healthy diet look like? And how do we get some more of those? What do healthy foods look like? And how do we get those healthy foods in our kids? So there's recipes in the book. And also the 4th step is all about addressing picky eating. So if you're thinking, well, this sounds neat, but my child's a picky eater, and the healthy principles are things that I don't know how I'm going to do, just be just aware that you're not alone. In fact, 70% of families are in the same boat as you, because about 70% of children with autism are picky eaters. And so this is all written keeping in mind that most of you are going to have a child that maybe isn't familiar with a lot of these foods and might have some restricted eating patterns.
I think the other thing too, Julie, is my encouragement to parents out there who are stepping into this, or even the parents who've been around for a while, still kind of working through some of the challenges of trying different strategies, particularly from a dietary standpoint, is just be patient. Mm-hmm. And just keep moving forward. It's not about perfection. It's about making progress.
Yes.
And these things evolve over time. I often tell parents, you're going to know a lot more in 3 months than you do now, a lot more in 6 months if you keep moving forward. Keep reading, keep searching, keep asking questions. And your book answers a lot of questions that are out there. So let me ask you this, and then we'll kind of wrap things up.
Okay.
What about some other action steps that families and individuals can take in improving their health and wellness beyond just dietary changes? What are some things that perhaps you talk about in your consulting practice that you've seen, or maybe even just personally, with regards to yourself, your family, that you find very helpful in this overall approach?
That's a good one. Lifestyle is really important. Things like physical activity. So it doesn't have to be some rigorous or some like very strict, boring exercise that, kids don't want to do, but just getting out in nature, going for a walk, getting fresh air, getting oxygen, getting the blood moving. Those kinds of things can really be beneficial. And in that study, we also looked at other types of therapies and things like physical activity. And it was actually a question that I've asked for years in my intake form is, how does your child do with physical activity? And almost everybody says great. And so I think just that is a good one. Actually, step 6 in the program is taking care of yourself as a parent. So, maybe if you decided to go for a walk, maybe you want a little time on your own. So maybe you go for the walk by yourself, but maybe there are some times that maybe you go for a walk as a family, or you go do something where you get outside and get fresh air and all of that. And it will really benefit everybody. And, it's a great stress reliever. Just being in trees is, like forest bathing in Japan, just being in among the trees without any vigorous exercise is very beneficial as well. So I think anything like that where you just have time to connect, not too many demands put on you, get some, energy moving. I think those types of things really go much further than we realize, and are things that, that are fun for most of us and a great way to bond with our kids. So I think that, any types of strategies like that would be fun. Other stress relievers, I talk about EFT and things like that in my book. But, I think the easiest one is just get outside with your kids.
I love the forest bathing. In fact, I recently had a paper. I think it was the author of that. There was a book on forest bathing, a Japanese doctor who did research on natural killer cell activity. And they found that actually spending time in the forest significantly raises natural killer cell activity. And natural killer cells are important for the immune system, particularly against viral infections and cancer cells. So just being exposed to trees that way can have a significant impact. In fact, another book I've read it a couple times, is by a naturalist by the name of Richard Louv, called Last Child in the Woods. And it was all of the research about what's happened in our society. It's not just the United States, it's around the world for the most part, particularly in the Western world, is the loss of connection to nature, particularly amongst childhood. So everything's now organized sports, organize that. and getting kids out and just having playtime. And one of the things I've seen over the years, Julie, along with diet, and of course supplements and working on gut function and these other core aspects of biomedical intervention is absolutely essential, is just what you said. Getting out, being active, getting natural sunlight, breathing the air, whatever it is, spending time with the family, walking the forest, going to the beach. These things often, I think, get overlooked, underappreciated, and often missed in the types of programs that we develop for people. So
yes, I agree. And, it is a lot of work to be a parent, and we all can use the time to it's beneficial for everybody. We can use that time. And it really does kind of, at least I know for me, it kind of resets my nervous system a little bit. And it's just such a wonderful time to spend.
100%. So, Julie, what are some resources you have, and how do people get in touch with you?
Yeah, so I have one-on-one consulting that I do. I have programs for parents, like group programs for parents. I have programs for practitioners that want to learn more. So they can find all of that at my website, juliematthews-nutrition.com. And they can find, my books on Amazon, easy to find. Those are probably, I have a number of different websites, but that one website can take you to all of them.
Okay. And that'll be in your bio as well on the webpage. So, Julie, it's been a pleasure. I love your book. I'm so happy you wrote it. I know it was a long time coming. It's extremely helpful. I know a lot of other people are getting benefit from as well. It's been an absolute pleasure to have known you and worked with you all of these years. And, let's keep up the good work. Congratulations on all that you do and the families you're helping. And, thank you.
Well, thank you so very much. It has been such a pleasure to work with you over the years. You're such a proponent of all of these concepts, and you're one of the doctors that I think really understands the value of diet to a level that, many do not. And I think it makes you a wonderful doctor because you're really able to help patients with all the different aspects and kind of pull everything all together. So I appreciate everything you do and really appreciate your time today.
Well, thank you.
You've been listening to the Functional Medicine Doc Talk podcast with Dr. Kurt Woeller. For more information about this podcast, go to functionalmedicinedoctalk.com.